Welcome, everyone. My name is Maddie Reardon. I am the Community Engagement Manager for 88.9 Radio Milwaukee. First and foremost, I'd like to thank each of you for attending today's event and for your commitment to continuing to have difficult conversations that can and will spark change and action. I also want to thank the Argosy Foundation and the Zilber Family Foundation for their generous support of this project. And of course, our Radio Milwaukee family, staff, listeners, and contributing members. We could not do this work without you. For those of you who may not be familiar with Radio Milwaukee, we are a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station that focuses on the positive things that are happening in our community and the tough conversations that spark action and positive change. Like other nonprofits, we rely on people like you for support to keep us on air, online, and in the community. So if you do feel so inclined, please visit radiomilwaukee.org and click the orange heart to donate so that we can keep doing the great work we do in our city. Please keep your microphones muted so we can keep our focus on Nate, Reggie, and Tarik. And if you do have anything to add or share, please use the chat function. You can link articles or resources and ask any questions. If we do have time at the end, we're going to take questions from the chat, so please plop them in there. The questions that Nate is going to be asking Tarik and Reggie today came from you, our members, our listeners, our community members, which I'm really, really excited about. Without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Nate Emig, our Director of Content.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you so much for being here tonight. This has been a year. 2020 has been a difficult year, and for me and Tarik, this was really the most rewarding project I think that I had the chance to work on this year, and we're just very, very, very proud of the conversations that we've been able to start because of this podcast. And it's really been just a true delight working with Tarik and Reggie on this project. The topics are difficult, like you said, Maddie, but we hope that by getting into the data and talking about the things that we might kind of sense and hear about and understand about our city in kind of a emotional way and kind of an intangible way, our goal was really to put this into data and solutions and focus on the history, how we got here, to talk about the data that exists, and then really look at the solutions that are being developed here in Milwaukee that could perhaps even be scaled to other cities. So we hear all the time from our community and from our members how much they enjoy hearing about the positive things that are happening in the city and the work that's being done to make Milwaukee a better place and a more equitable place for all. So we wanted to make sure to include that portion in every episode. So you definitely hear the data and the undeniable data of systemic racism. And then we also talk about those solutions. So we've got some really great questions. And I think that's really what we hope was the goal of this podcast, was to start these conversations, to start asking some of these questions, and to not be afraid to just, when you don't know the answer, to reach out and to ask some questions. So we got some really great questions here this evening. I wanted to just kind of bring it full circle too. I think this project is just such a cool way to really see Radio Milwaukee's mission in action, because really this started as a community event just like this back in, this is February of last year. 2019, I believe it was, where Reggie hosted a conversation at 88.9 called Having Better Conversations About Race. And that's where I actually first met Reggie. And I imagine some of the folks here in the audience were also at that event. And I was just blown away by how he was able to present this story of Milwaukee and how it parallels to things happening around the country in such a compact format, and to put it into such plain language that was so undeniable and so data driven. It was really an eye-opening and special experience being in the audience that night. And I feel like I learned a lot. So as soon as I saw Reggie speak, I was like, we got to do more with Reggie. We could do a podcast, with him or something. And then Tarik Moody had a bunch of ideas. So it really came together through this event like this. And then through our members allowing us to make this kind of content, we were able to really take some time and develop this idea and put it out this year. Now, we actually plan to put the podcast out much later. but because of everything that was happening in the country with Black Lives Matter, we thought we were really poised to tell this story at a really timely and pivotal moment for the country. So we were originally planning to release this in in October. We fast tracked it to August, and we were really proud that we were able to get this conversation out to the public when it felt like we really needed to be talking about it. So that's kind of how it came to be. And I've got my list of questions here. Maybe we should just, are we able to do kind of a show of hands or got it? So are we to assume that most everybody has listened to the podcast? I see a few faces, but everybody for the most part? Okay, cool. So you know Reggie then, you know Tarik. I'll turn it over to you guys quick if you want to just do a quick introduction before we get into the questions.
Go, Reggie.
Oh, okay. My name is Reggie Jackson. This is not my house, everybody, so don't even think that I'm living like that. It's a green screen behind me, and that's an image from the Showtime show Billions, the famous guy on that show. That's his office, beautiful art. So I say, let me make that my background. But I don't want anybody to think I'm living like that. I'm a regular guy. I'm co-owner of a company called Nurture and Diversity Partners. Here in Milwaukee, we do diversity, equity, inclusion training, mostly around the state of Wisconsin in 40 different communities. We've also done work in 20 different states. A lot of people know me from my work over the last nearly 20 years with America's Black Holocaust Museum. And I just try to take the things that I've learned and share those with other people so that people can have different conversations than they've had before, what I call productive conversations. And this is my passion. And appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast with Tarik. It's been great conversation. It's been great, getting to know how much people enjoyed the podcast. It's just been a fascinating journey.
Well, this is my background. My bedroom's right 2 feet away. So my name is Tarik. I am Director of Digital Strategy for 88.9 Radio Milwaukee. I've been here since the beginning. I'm also on air Monday through Fridays, 9 to midnight, and host a show called Rhythm Live Radio, celebrated its 15th anniversary this year, starting in Minneapolis. I am not from Milwaukee. This is my 9th city I lived in. I grew up in Atlanta, and I'm a proud graduate of HBCU by the name of Howard University, which some of you might recognize that name due to some potentially vice president-elect. So that's all I have to say.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get into it. I've got my questions here. Got a lot of them to get through. This is you guys are going to be great, but the idea is let's just call it like you see it, So I know you guys are going to. I know you've seen some of the questions. Some of these might be a surprise to you. So I want to start with something just kind of broad here. This question came. This is the first one that really got my attention. What's the difference between being non-racist and being anti-racist?
I think it's about your level of activity. I think that you can be non-racist, but you're not really fighting to do anything about the racism that exists. And anti-racist is a person that actively involves themselves in the work of getting rid of racism. It's great that so many people are not racist, but you are not impacting the people around you who are. You're not impacting the institutions around you that have racism embedded in them. An anti-racist person is someone who is actively engaged in communicating the fact that racism is systemic, and that's embedded in the systems and institutions in our country, and that we need to do things differently moving forward. So to me, that's the difference. It's just the level of engagement and activity.
Kind of like a difference is like someone's like needs help, you go actively help somebody. That's anti-racist. Person's with the video camera watching, that's a bystander, that's non-racist. You kind of put it in terms that way.
That's great. And the reason I wanted to start there is because I think that's where a lot of us are coming to the podcast, where it's we are recognizing, of course, that systemic racism needs more attention. But I think a lot of folks are like, what kind of action can we take, and where do we go next, and what kind of small steps can you start with to even get the ball rolling in your life? So that's being anti-racist, right? And it's the active work. And I think that's where a lot of us are coming to this podcast. And I love, Reggie, what you said in the past about kind of that middle ground that you try to reach people at, and knowing that there's folks on both sides of the fringes that are just never going to come to the middle. They're never going to be open to these ideas, perhaps, but you're looking for those folks that are in the middle.
Yeah, America is like a bell curve, and most of us are right there in the middle somewhere, right? There are people, it's kind of a spectrum of understanding of systemic racism, and some people will never believe systemic racism exists, and some people are, staunch defenders of the idea of systemic racism, and then everybody else is somewhere in the middle, and people are leaning one direction or the other. And to me, those people who have become actively engaged, and when I say actively engaged, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily out there doing something, protesting or whatever. To me, the first step in becoming actively engaged is to educate yourself, to learn more, to learn the things that you didn't learn in school, so that you can really understand these issues and the history of America. Because all of us, regardless of who we were cheated in our history classes. We didn't learn a lot of the ugly truths about American history. And because we didn't, we don't really understand how we got here. So the first step that I always tell people to take is to re-educate yourself, to become actively engaged in learning the true history of America. That way you can begin to have different conversations, and then that'll take you wherever it takes you.
Tarik, I want to throw this one to you. This question comes in from a member that says, is it wrong to say that you are colorblind? Why or why not? And does that play a role in systemic racism? And if so, how? So colorblind.
Yeah. So if you think about it, colorblind, you basically say you don't see that person for who that person is. You just, someone told me basically when someone says colorblind, you're basically centering on the person who said it, their culture. You're ignoring their background, you're ignoring their experience, you know what they've gone through. You're saying, I don't see color. It's about to say, I don't see religion. I don't see disabilities. I don't see abilities. You're basically ignoring who they are, your humanity. And so that plays a role when you ignore that, and that becomes in the systems, education, your whole education is centered around white-centric education. And so you're ignoring their past. They're like, we're your students. We're America. You don't need to know anything about your history. This is our history. You need to know that. So you're telling people to adapt to make yourself feel comfortable. That's when people say colorblind.
Yeah, thoughts on that, Reggie?
Yeah, as I've traveled around Wisconsin, one of the things that I've heard from people far and wide, all over the state, is that white people have told me that they've been taught to be colorblind their entire lives, that's a good thing, right? And when I talk to them about it, I basically say the same thing that Tarik said, is that you're really ignoring the lived experiences of people who aren't white by saying that you're colorblind, by saying, everybody's the same. No, everyone is not the same. You can't tell me that when I walk into a room, you don't see a black man walk into the room. That doesn't mean you have to judge me as a stereotype of what you think a black man is supposed to be. But ignoring people's lived experiences is something that is really counterproductive to being an anti-racist, because what you're saying is that the color of your skin doesn't matter. And anybody with half a brain who's thought about it and studied American history knows that it absolutely does matter. Now, it doesn't matter all the time in every place you're in, but it matters a lot. And to dismiss that, the message that you're sending is that I don't think that the lived experiences of the group that you belong to is important enough for me to consider the fact that your life could be different.
It's kind of like, imagine saying somebody to a Jewish person, like, I'm religious blind. I don't need Hanukkah. We all celebrate holidays. That's offensive, right? You would never say that. Or I don't believe Christmas. We're all the same. You'd probably be offended by that. So that's the same thing. So just put it in that perspective of religion, because people are really passionate about their religion, Catholic, Protestants. No one that says, oh, I'm religious blind. We all believe in God. We should have our own share holidays together.
Yeah, and that really builds into this, something you mentioned, Reggie, about spaces. This another question I think really ties into that colorblind really well. So the question is, why is it important to create spaces for Black people only or Latino people only? What is the reasoning or desire to create spaces like that? Does that harm what we're trying to achieve in terms of racial understanding and equality?
Well, I don't think that it does at all. I think that you have to understand that there are very specific things that people of color experience, right? And that the only time they really get to really express it in the way that they really want to is with other people of the group that they belong to. There are shared experiences that, are really critical in terms of the decision making that people make, that you have to make among your peers. It's no different than let's just say you had a project you were working on, right? You were building some new skyscraper in Milwaukee. And no one would have a problem with all of the engineers getting together in a room together to talk about the engineering, right? No one would have a problem with all of the architects getting together in a room and talking about what they do. It's the same thing, because there are very specific things within those communities where people need a space to share without feeling that there are other people in the room who will be doubters, right? That's one of the things that people that I know in the community that are doing anti-racism work. One of the things that I've heard from a lot of Black people, and not so much from Latinos, but from a lot of Black people, is that there's fatigue that's built into constantly having to teach white people about this stuff. You just get tired of it. It's like, man, we've been shouting from the rooftops about this stuff and white people haven't been listening. And maybe if we have these conversations among our peers, then we can have more productive conversations. But I think there's room for, those homogenous groups, but there's also room for groups that are more diverse as well. I say the same thing about white people. White people need to get more comfortable having conversations about racism with just white people, which is something that, we would never do that. People would never really propose that. But listen, that's something that has to happen. White people have to have those open, honest conversations in a space where there are no people of color at. Because I think that when you're in a space like that, that it relieves some of the burden of feeling some level of guilt, or that someone is going to point a finger at you, things of that nature. I don't see any problem with it at all.
I mean, a good example is I grew up in high school. I had 8 Black students out of 500 kids in my class. That was very weird and uncomfortable after times. You're back in your head, you're always thinking, what are they thinking? Then I go to Howard University. I don't have those thoughts. I have the ability to be a student without thinking, is this professor being racist? Am I being followed around? Is a security guard chasing me? It's like all those things you hear about students have to deal with in PWIs, which predominantly white institutions, I didn't have to deal with. That allowed me to develop as a good student, as a leader, to make an impact. And that's why people champion HBCUs, because that experience, you're kind of isolated from the American experience of worrying about other things instead of worrying about your education.
Yeah, well said. And that level of comfort is something that we talked about in the first episode in Systemic Racism 101, of just being comfortable in a space, and that ties into this idea about like creating these spaces for, and when we talk about spaces for Black people only, that can be a lot of things. That can be like you said, HBCUs, that can be opportunities. And Reggie, you talked about in the podcast about, all we got to do is do the same thing that we did for white people, right? We do that for Black people. And so I could just I see how those thoughts connect. And I'm curious if you want to maybe expand on that a little bit about creating those spaces.
Yeah, as I do this work, and I've been doing this work for close to 20 years, most of it here in Milwaukee, but also, around the state, built relationships with folks in La Crosse and Wausau and Appleton and Racine, Kenosha, Madison, a lot of different places. And what I find is that people really want to do the work. They really want to find out how to do the work, right? They want to figure out, what are the types of spaces we create where we can be comfortable doing this work? And I think one of the things that people have to understand, it's not going to be comfortable work. This is not easy work. You're trying to dismantle a system that's been around for 400 years. And you have to understand that it's not a simple thing to do. A lot of the mindsets, a lot of the attitudes, a lot of the biases that we have that are embedded in our unconscious mind are not things that just go away. And I think importantly, when I talk about, and I say this, people have criticized me for saying this. When people ask, well, what's the solution? I say, just do for people of color what you've done for white people for hundreds of years and everything will be okay. What I'm simply saying is level the playing field. white people have had advantages throughout American history that they've denied to people of color, and had people of color had access to those same advantages that whites were given by the government primarily and other institutions, then we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation today, because things would have played out the same for everybody. You know, we like to think that America's been, you know, a place that's been an equal opportunity for everybody, but that's just it's so untrue. It's just ridiculous. And this isn't just things that happened many years ago. These are things that are happening even to this day. We still have those types of issues. And I think that that's part of the reason that people want to get into those spaces. So when you get a group of Black people together, they can talk about something within that institution that they're in that white people don't have a clue that's going on, because it's invisible to white people. It's like the old saying of, you know, the fish never see the water because they're in it all the time. And there are things that happen in spaces where marginalized groups of people have certain experiences that they can talk about, that other people wouldn't even fathom that that's something. No, they would make an excuse that, well, it must be something else. No, if enough people experience the same thing and they all have the same thing in common, which is that, you know, they're all either women, or they're all either LGBTQ plus people, or they're all Black or Latino or Asian and Native American, they notice that these patterns exist. And I think they want to have those conversations and tie those things to the types of changes we have to have in the conversations about these topics.
All right, Tarik, this one is for you. I think this is a good Tarik question. Do you think that younger generations are, I'm going to air quote here, more woke than older generations? If so, what impact can younger generations have on their parents and grandparents, or could they not? So is the younger generation more woke?
Yes and no, I guess, is the question. Yes, you see people on TikTok using their influence to talk about these issues. And you see young people who are completely blind to these issues. So, you know, racism is a taught thing, right? So some kids learn to get away from their parents' ideology. Some kids don't. For the new generation, for them to actually have an impact, they have to be also allowed, just like Black people, allowed to the table of influence as well, right? If they're not listened to or given opportunities to, you know, teach and show, then the impact is not the same either, right? So that's a tough question to answer. There's not a yes or a no question. I mean, you know, Taylor Swift or someone like that uses her platform, young person, there's impact because she has power influence. So not every young person has that same power influence, you know. So that's my answer to that one. It's kind of a hard question to say, but on average, I've seen more young people a little more engaged with these issues because maybe their favorite artist is engaged with issues. So, you know, it's a hard question.
Well, that connects really well to my next question. I know we're all looking forward to the holiday season. It's going to be a weird holiday season this year, a lot of distance and traditions being uprooted. But families and friends and loved ones will still be gathering, I think, in some way virtually or checking in. We still will feel, I hope, some kind of warmth in the country around the holiday season, which leads into these conversations that maybe aren't so warm that you get into around the dinner table. So to follow up on the younger generation being woke and or not, and being able to talk to their family, their parents and grandparents. I guess, we're going into Thanksgiving, how do you start bringing up some of these conversations in a way post-election, hopefully in a more united country? How do we bring these conversations up with friends and family, especially during the holidays?
Well, I've always joked that we all have an Uncle Bob that says inappropriate things around Thanksgiving table, right? And to me, that's a good place to start. If Uncle Bob makes that racist joke like he does every Thanksgiving, don't get mad at Uncle Bob about the joke, right? Instead, say, Uncle Bob, why is that funny to you? Because it's not really funny to me. Can you explain to me why you think that's funny? And, you know, I always think that just engaging people in questions, asking people, instead of assuming that you know why they feel the way that they feel, asking them to explain themselves. Because oftentimes what happens is when they try to explain themselves, they'll trip over themselves and they'll realize, you know what? maybe that isn't such a good joke to tell every Thanksgiving. It doesn't have to be confrontational. I think a lot of stuff has been confrontational because people want to force someone to feel the exact same way they feel, but it really doesn't work. People hold on to their feelings very strongly. They have very strong emotional attachments to the lifestyle that they've led and the belief systems that they have. And you can't spend Thanksgiving or some other holiday trying to, turn Uncle Bob around. It just doesn't work. But what you can do is just to question people, like, why is it that, you make these particular statements about men? I mean, I've had to do this with family members of mine who've said stuff about people from the LGBT community, right? And I asked them, I said, why do you have a problem with trans people? Can you explain that to me? What's the problem you have with trans people, right? And eventually they realize that, man, I don't really know why I have a problem with trans people. I just, I just say it, but I really don't. So just engaging people in questions instead of trying to shut them up or shout them down, just ask them to explain themselves. And I think that goes a long way towards alleviating an argument. Now, it may end up that person may want to argue with you, but I try not to argue with people about this stuff myself.
Yeah, what do you think, Tarik?
I agree. I mean, yeah, I learned arguing doesn't help. Like, I don't really have these issues in my family, right? I mean, I had issues with my dad said something like, he comes to me and goes like, he was going to a class. He goes like, yo, son, like, they got mad at me when I said Oriental. I'm like, yeah, Dad, but I don't get it. Like, I said that when I was younger. I'm like, so what if I said Negro in class? What would you do, Dad? Oh, so you're saying Oriental's like Negro? Yes, Dad. That's all I did, right? And he get it. Like, my dad's a little more open-minded when he's older, but that's, you just ask a question. You may put the shoe on the other foot for them. Like, are they Christian? What if somebody attacks your religion, dude? Made a Christian joke about Christmas. How would you feel? So it's like, try to put that person in that other person's shoes. How have you been offended? How'd you feel when someone tells you offended jokes? That's how I do it.
Yeah, words matter. I know we talked about representation matters throughout the podcast, and the language that we use to describe viewpoints and people matters. So this question, actually, this ties perfectly into the next question here. This one isn't really about systemic racism, but it's about language and language playing a role in how people interpret each other in conversations. So how do you know what terminology to use? And this person cites Black, African American, people of color. So how do you know the right words to use?
You ask. Basically, you ask.
You ask a person, which term are you comfortable with? Because I tell people all the time, my birth certificate, I was born in Mississippi, my birth certificate says my race is colored. Doesn't say Negro, doesn't say Black, African American, it says colored. I would never introduce myself as a colored man, right? I mean, but that's kind of old terminology. And people are always being tripped up, African American, Afro-American, Black, whatever. Everybody has their own preference. Me, particularly, I prefer Black. It rolls off my lips a lot easier than African American does.
And plus,
so
Black.
That's my preference.
So when you say African American, you might notice that might be somebody from London, Jamaica, Nigeria. When you say African American, they're not American. So saying Black is kind of a unifying kind of term. And I think trend-wise, people are leaning towards that. But again, you just ask.
Yeah, and it's not like there's some mystique about this. I mean, you can just ask a person, right? Maybe we don't need to be so cautious. We could just look at a person like a human being and say, what do you prefer? And that's it, right?
Yeah, it goes to this idea that a lot of people have, people who are here from maybe a culture that they're not, really, they haven't been around this particular culture. And they, one of the questions you hear people say, that people ask them, like, what are you? Like, what do you mean, what am I? I'm a human being. Well, where are you from? All you have to do is ask a person, what's your nationality? If a person is from Korea, they're going to proudly tell you, I'm Korean. If they're Pakistani, they're going to probably say, I'm Pakistani. Whatever it may be, all you have to do is ask. Don't assume. just ask. My wife is African American. Her father's from Arkansas. Her mother's from Georgia. And people used to ask all the time, "What are you?" She's like, "What do you mean? You can't be black." It's like, my daddy's black, my mama's black. I must be black too. So I don't know what you're talking about. I may not look like every black person that you know, but you just have to be comfortable asking a person, because people tend to be very proud of their background. When you ask a white person, have you ever heard someone ask a white person, "What are you?" before? Probably not, right? But you ask a white person about their nationality, and say, "Well, my on my father's side we're Scottish," or whatever it may be. People are really proud of the ethnicity and the background of their family members. You just have to ask. You may hear some things that's like, "Oh, wow, I never knew that about you before."
So I've got one more question here from kind of the world. We put the call out on social media for some questions, and then we'll get into some questions here in the chat. But this one I think is a perfect way to close things out. So if I, as a white person, make a mistake in my actions or my language towards a marginalized group, what's the best way for me to react?
Acknowledge that you made a mistake, apologize. Like, I've done, and I'm not with race, but I've said some things when I was younger, and I apologized to like women or something, and I apologized, right? And I said, "Oh, dude, I shouldn't have said that. That's stupid." And that's the best you can do. You're going to make mistakes. A decent person understands that. They get it, right? So just acknowledge that you made a mistake.
Yeah, I agree with Tarik. Just acknowledge that you made a mistake, apologize, and then engage a person in a conversation about how it made them feel. I had very recently, I had a teacher reached out to me, and she said something inappropriate in a space with some of her students. And right away she realized that it was wrong to say that, but she apologized right away. And she reached out to me and said, "Was that enough, Reggie?" I said, "Well, it could be, but I said, what I would suggest you do is you reach out to those African-American students in your class and ask if they'd like to have a conversation with you and kind of share their feelings with you. Because to me, that allows you to kind of clear the air. People are going to make mistakes. I mean, that's part of being a human being. We make mistakes. We do stuff that we is cringeworthy even to us later. But apologizing, and listen, I always say this, issue a real apology. Don't issue one of these, "Oh, I apologize if anyone was offended" apology. That's not an apology, because people were offended. When you say, "I apologize if anyone was offended," you're basically saying, "I'm not really apologizing." Or if there's a right way and a wrong way to apologize. Just realize that a lot of times when you say stuff that's inappropriate, people are not going to say anything to you about it, but their body language is going to say a lot about it. Pay attention to body language.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a really interesting point too. And that goes back to about treating somebody just like you would treat somebody of your own race. I mean, everybody has body language, right? And everybody, you can tell when you're making somebody uncomfortable, when you're choosing the wrong words. And if you step over, and if you think you did, it's probably better to just say, to maybe say like, "Hey, let me walk that back," or "Let me apologize," or "Let me acknowledge that I said that." It's probably better to err on that side than to be afraid to talk about it, right?
Yeah, and as a person who is offended by those things, you have to take it into context. Tarik mentioned that earlier. I like to use this example of something that happened to me years ago. It was a program I did for a group of folks here in Metro Milwaukee during Black History Month. They wanted me to talk about some famous Black women. So I did the program, and this really very old white woman came up to me to thank me for the program, and she was there with her granddaughter. And she said, "Mr. Jackson, that was a wonderful program. You did a wonderful job, and you are such a credit to your race, Mr. Jackson." Now, I could have very easily been offended by this woman, and her granddaughter turned beet red immediately, but I couldn't be mad at this woman. I knew that was her generation. That was how they used to talk. So I knew that it was a compliment coming from her. I could have taken it the opposite way and gotten mad, but I was like, listen, we have to understand that things change, people change, and the things that we're accustomed to saying, just like Tarik said, his father saying Oriental. My mother used to say Oriental, and so I'm like, "Mom, that's not the term that people prefer anymore. So understand that you can't get mad every time somebody does it, because they're not intentionally trying to hurt your feelings. It's just, they just don't get it. And so, I always like to use that example because I appreciated the fact that this woman liked what I said. And that was a compliment in her mind. And her granddaughter apologized for her. I'm like, you don't have to apologize for your grandmother. I get it. I grew up around a bunch of elderly people in my family in Mississippi. So I know that they say stuff that's like, you still saying that? This isn't like 1947 anymore. But I get it. You were 25 in 1947, so I get it. I'm not bothered by it that much.
We're going to go to the chat here. We're going to start here with this question from Brent Arnold, who asks, how do you educate people that say they are not racist, but they are? How do you educate Black people that don't believe racism exists?
You can take that one, Reggie.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever heard any Black person say that racism doesn't exist.
Oh yeah, there's a few.
It definitely did. Yeah, I was volunteering at the polls on Tuesday, and I was totally shocked, but I couldn't believe myself. But one of the people I was volunteering with, literally, I had to explain what racism was to him because he didn't believe that it really existed.
I mean, there's Candace Owens out there. There's a lot of people who want to deny it. I don't know what you say to them. Like, you can educate them, you can try. Like, it's kind of what Reggie said in the beginning. It's like, I'm gonna fight the battle with the people who want to learn. Like,
yeah,
if a person's so strung out, like, this is my belief, you're not gonna change my mind, you're not gonna educate me, you're not gonna tell me to read a book, I'm not gonna waste my energy. As long as you don't disrespect me, we're cool. I'm gonna worry about people who want to learn. Like, that's too much energy to waste.
Yeah, and when you put it that way, I can see that maybe that's a blind spot for me. I mean, this shows you just like your bubbles that you live in and the circles you live in. To me, like, I don't know anybody that's denying it, but then you meet them, right? So, Reggie, do you have any thoughts on that about how you talk to somebody who says they're not racist, but you probably are getting that vibe?
Well, I think a lot of times the reason people don't think that they're racist is because they don't understand what racism is, right? They think that racism is individual acts of bigotry, and those things happen, right? Anybody can be prejudiced. Anybody can prejudge people based on the group that they belong to. Everybody is capable of that. But, the way that we define racism, and there's 50 million different definitions of racism. So people don't have the same definitions. So if someone says to me that, racism isn't real, first question I ask is, well, how do you define racism? Tell me how you define it. And more than likely what you'll discover is that they define it differently than you do. So what is racist in your definition won't necessarily be racist in their definition. So it doesn't make sense to try to argue with people. And I've known Black people and I've known Hispanic people that say racism is a myth, that, that we're our own worst enemies. And I just shake my head and it's like, you know what? I'm going to work on the people in the middle. I'm not going to work on the people on the ends of the bell curve because they're stuck where they are. And I think that they're going to, in many cases, some of those people of color who believe that it's not that bad. It's not that bad until they're the victim of it and they become the next, Sterling Brown, who, happens to pull into a Walgreens late at night. And the next thing, he's on the ground being tased by the police. Or, other famous African-Americans who have, preferred to believe that racism wasn't all that bad. Morgan Freeman, he and I share a hometown. He lived in my hometown as a little boy. So I see him there every now and then when I'm down in Mississippi. I remember him famously saying years ago that racism would go away if Black people would just stop talking about it. You don't hear him saying that mess anymore, right? So, people may feel that way in that moment. That doesn't mean that they're going to feel that way all the time. And I think a lot of times you look at the audience that's around when they say those things. I think there are a lot of Black people that want to really make white people feel comfortable by saying that, listen, I feel the same way that you guys do. Racism is a myth. And, as soon as the white people leave, they're like, man, I really don't believe that, but I wanted them to, so there's fakers. Don't pay attention to those people. Just keep it moving, man. Don't try to don't try to convince somebody who believes that the earth is flat, that the earth isn't flat, because they're going to live their entire lives believing the earth is flat.
Yeah, well said. Any thoughts on that, Tarik?
I mean, I echo that. Again, I don't want to waste my energy. I used to waste my energy. It's like, it's tiresome. It's like, why am I trying to convince this person that has nothing to do with my life? You know, it's a person I just met. Like, why? It's not worth my energy. You know, I'd rather focus on people who want to change, who want to make a difference, who want to learn. You know, it's kind of like a teacher in a school is like, well, hey, that person's walking. I should teach them about math. Like, why you bother me? I don't want to learn math. Teach the people who want to go to your class. You know, it's not worth the energy to deal with the extremes. I mean, you can't convince it because they're set in their ways. They will fight you no matter what data you put up, or what argument, or what experience, or what even like clear evidence of racism you show them. They're gonna like, well, what did that person do to deserve it? Mm. You know, and that's the same with sexism, right? People they do the same thing with sexism. Like, what did that person do to deserve it? You know, and you can't battle that.
So, one thing that I think really made the podcast special, and I got to credit Maddie Reardon, our community engagement manager, who organized this event, is the discussion and the resource guides that we put together to accompany each episode. So as you're listening to the podcast, there's ways to really begin having these conversations with people in your life and to kind of have a guide to work off of that Maddie really carefully put together. So it's a really crucial piece of the puzzle. And there's on a few of the discussion guides, there's actual like reading recommendations, books. So maybe one of you can address this question. So of course, look at those resource guides. But this person asks, where can we find evidence-based resources that can be used in our organizations to help start and create change? So evidence-based resources to use in organizations.
Well, I think the resource list, that we're given as a result of the podcast, that's a really good place to go. I mean, there's copious, amounts of evidence of these, systemic racism being a real thing, but there's still people who doubt it. And it really, based on the organization that you work in, it's really based on what you're trying to get to, right? So for instance, I recently did some work with the Milwaukee Brewers Foundation. And part of what they wanted to talk about was, what are some of the barriers to getting over some of the challenges Milwaukee has from the philanthropic community. And one of the things that I pointed out to them is that, well, the philanthropic community is a very white space. It has been a very white space. Most foundations, over 90% of foundations are run by whites. A majority of the funding for foundations, the grants that they give, most of it goes to white people, right? So there was a report done by an organization that studies kind of philanthropy, and they showed that out of the something like $24 billion worth of grants that were issued in 2018, only 0.3% went to men and boys of color. 0.6% went to women and girls of color. And overall, people of color only received 10% out of all of the grants that were given. So depending on the specific space that you're working on, the resources that you utilize will be different. If you're working in housing, in real estate and banking, there are very specific resources like, the book, The Color of Money, that Tarik mentioned, which is a great way of helping you to understand some of the systemic issues in finance. Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, really tells you about the history of why we have such a huge gap in housing between Black people and white people. So it really depends, I think, a great deal on the spaces that you're working in. There are very specific resources that are better in some spaces than they are in other spaces. But I always say that resource list, because each episode had specific resources related to not just the problems, but the solutions as well. Look through that resource list on the website and pick and choose what you think will be a good start for you.
Yeah, and what I've done, like part of the podcast, I use a lot of Google. looking for information. Like I came across Citibank put out a report, which got reported in the New York Times, that I realized that racism cost this country $16 trillion. And they have a 100-page report showing the evidence of this $16 trillion and showing that, you know, I know someone asked about racism and it's like, somebody like, why should I care about, how someone care about racial inequalities? I show racism costs the country $16 trillion, not black people, not white people. Everybody is losing money because of racism. And like, if you close the racial wealth gap, Citibank says it will help everybody out. It would help everybody out. So that kind of like to show that racism is not a black or brown problem. It's an American problem. And like sometimes money talks, right? Say, oh, what, racism is costing me money, right? You know, the city settles, every time cities settles with a police officer, that's your taxpayer money, right? And you're sitting there like, what did the guy do? Well, you know, you just lost taxpayer money from that. Maybe that's a way to start the conversation on racism. So it's like, I find these great reports. I'm big in the racial wealth gap, like the startup economy, and like learning about 2%, less than 2% of the venture capital goes to African Americans. Less than 1% goes to African American women of venture capital. Like, and that's an opportunity to close a wealth gap, you know. So there's a lot of reports, a lot of data. Brookings Institute, who we have done with, Maddie has done a great thing with. They had one of the Brookings Institute guys. Can't think of his name. I'm senile. Maddie.
Andre Perry.
Andre Perry has a great book. Why can't I think of the name? I'm just senile today.
Know Your Price.
Yeah.
Know Your Price. Well, it's a great book of data just showing like, you know, how black homes are devalued, which would total about $156 billion. And you put in perspective, that could pay for 4.4 million 4-year scholarships for students because you devalue black homes because of stereotypes, systemic racism that led to it.
Yeah, another book that we talked about explicitly was that book by Shirley Better. That was in episode 1, Reggie. That's one you recommend?
Yeah. Her book really talks a great deal about all of the specific types of racism and the benefits that accrue to people who practice those things. You know, we oftentimes talk about racism in a way that we talk about what happens to the victims of racism, but we don't talk about what value people get out of racism existing. For my column for the Milwaukee Independent, because of all these questions about systemic racism, I started a series. I wrote one article called Systemic Racism 101. Got some really good response to that. And I followed that up with a piece that came out today called Systemic Racism 201, looking at the advantages whites have gained from racism existing. So looking at the Homestead Act and how the land was taken from Native Americans and given to whites. Any white person who had $24 could get 160 acres of land. I talked about the role that the Federal Housing Administration played in preventing people of color from gaining home ownership. And that's how wealth is built in the United States. And so, I think understanding both sides of the coin, not only the damage that's done to the victims of racism, but the people who benefit from racism. Believe me, there are great many benefits. And one of the things that I listed, and you guys can read this column at the Milwaukee Independent, was all of the people that benefited from slavery who never were slaveholders. All the different ways you could benefit by being a person who wasn't a slaveholder. I think you'll be surprised when you see the list. And it's a comprehensive list, but the list could have easily had multiple more things in there other than the ones that I gave, because I think that we don't pay enough attention to both sides of the coin.
We really got to shout out the Milwaukee Independent. The pieces that you've written and contributed to Milwaukee Independent were just so informative, and really were a great reference throughout the podcast that we could look and point to these this research that you've done. And if if you're listening to this and watching this now, Reggie's got so much more writing at Milwaukee Independent that you can really get to a deeper understanding of so many different issues. So got to shout that important work out.
Thanks, Nate.
Now, going back to the chat here, there's a great discussion here. Looks like Lauren responded to Brent's question earlier about convincing people that deny racism. And she said that I started to care when I learned how much harm my not caring about racial equity has caused. I think most people don't want to cause harm to each other. I thought that was It was a really nice comment, Lauren, and I think speaks to the reason why we're here in the first place, because we want to see this country move past these issues, and we want to see systemic racism go away. That's why we're here, right? So, Tarik, you mentioned earlier that money talks. There's a question from somebody in the chat here. Where'd it go? Here we go. Tammy Radmer says, what are your favorite organizations for us to donate money to support? We talked about some of them in the podcast, of course. I know the Wisconsin Fair Housing Council was a big one. We talked about a lot of the solutions in each of the episodes. We talked about organizations. Fuel Milwaukee we mentioned. But are there other organizations that are working in this area that are worth supporting or that need support?
Well, one I like, just open Upstart Kitchen. What it do is, like, there's two ways for building wealth. One is housing, other way is entrepreneurship. Upstart Kitchen is an incubator for mostly Black and brown food entrepreneurs to grow their business. So they develop the recipes, develop whatever to grow their business. They're a nonprofit. They take donations. I'm a big proponent of entrepreneur, but I'm also a big proponent of capital. Like, people, Nixon had a thing, and Color Money talks about Black capitalism. Nixon was a big proponent of that, but he left out the capital part. He told them, like, get a job, do this, get a bill, but we're not going to give you money to do this, right? Even though, knowing well, Reggie can point out the history that other white businesses and got the capital to grow their business. So capital is huge. So programs like Upstart Kitchen is a great program that needs the capital to help these entrepreneurs out to grow their business, because business is independence. So that's one organization. There's a lot. I'll let Reggie, I don't want to pick favorites or anything, but.
Well, I think it really depends on what specific issue within society you want to work on. I think a lot of it isn't necessarily about finding an organization to support. It's about finding a cause to advocate for. For instance, I saw that someone had written in the chat, what about the education gap? The education gap, when you study what the education gap does, it's more than just about differing test scores between Black and white children, right? A lot of it is related to poverty. The greatest indicator of your well-being and how well you're going to do in school is family income. The people who tend to do well in school are people who come from families that have money. And the people who tend to do the worst are people who tend to come from families that don't have a lot of money. Now, there are always exceptions to those rules, but just in general, poverty, growing up in a high poverty community really lowers your chance of doing well in school, not just because the environment is different in terms of the funding for the schools. And I could give a whole lecture on the issue of property taxes being used to fund schools. It's just absolutely ridiculous. We are really the only country I know of that does that. Other countries, what they do is they look at a community and they say, well, this community is more in need. Let's give them more funding for their schools and bring them up to the standard of everyone else. But here we say, well, sorry, you live in a high poverty community. Your schools just aren't going to be as good as the ones in the suburbs. And this is the argument that some people try to make to me. And it's like, it's a ridiculous argument. Well, when you look at the per pupil cost, Milwaukee Public Schools per pupil cost is higher than it is in some of the suburban school districts. I'm like, okay, have you been to some of the suburban schools? Have you seen what they look like? They don't have schools in the suburbs. They have campuses in the suburbs. I've spoken at these schools. I've spoken to staff. I've spoken to students. I've spoken to, community members. And you can't tell me that you can compare a school in Wauwatosa or a school in Whitefish Bay or Mequon to any school in Milwaukee Public Schools. We got these old raggedy buildings. You have legacy costs that none of the other districts have. You have tens of thousands of people that have retired from MPS that are being paid a pension. You have all of these old raggedy buildings that cost a lot of money to heat and cool. You have $70 million a year being spent busing kids around the city, just within the city. You have all of these costs, and you don't take those into consideration. And I always say, when people challenge me on that, I said, okay, if your kid is going to school in Franklin, pick a school in MPS you prefer to have them in. Just pick one. And then we can make the arrangements to have your child go to that school instead of the schools in Franklin. Of course, nobody would ever do that, right? So a lot of times I think it's about finding a specific issue that you are most concerned about and advocating for it, but not necessarily about, giving money to an organization. Or, if you don't have money, give time. There are a lot of volunteer opportunities in the community. I've done work with a lot of people who are dealing with, food insecurity, working on those issues, volunteering at, places that are providing food for not individuals, but for families, which is the greatest growing amount of people that are insecure, food insecure, are not individuals, but they're families, entire families that are struggling. So find just some issue that you feel very passionate about, find out who's doing work in that community, in that space, and then just join forces with them.
Another thing is be politically engaged. A lot of this can help with policies. Know what your alderman, mayor represent, like call them. People call them about a lot of other things. If you want to talk to you like, wait, hey, Milwaukee, why are my property taxes going to education? Why can't we change this? Galvanate, that's time as well. Because a lot of people want to fight for that. Like in Atlanta, they fought for get rid of cash bail, which contributes to the issue of wealth gap and employment and all this stuff. So people fought that and they got rid of it, right? They got together to say, this is hurting our community. That didn't take money. That took time, but it didn't take money to do that. They changed the laws in the books. Like we have cash bail in this city, right? Isn't that true, Reggie? We do?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That affects a lot of things like in the community.
Yeah, in the cities like Atlanta, like New York, that have gotten rid of cash bail, after they got rid of it, they question, why do we have it in the first place? It didn't make any sense. Someone's going to sit in jail. They've been charged with something, so they've been arrested and charged, but we haven't found them guilty. But because they're too poor to pay $500 or $1,000 or whatever it may be, they're going to rot in jail because none of their family members have the money to get them out. And then, after they spend 3 weeks in jail, we're dropping the charges and they let them out. In the meantime, they've lost their job.
Yep.
The girlfriend that they were in a relationship with, they said, well, I can't be with you because, you weren't around. A lot of bad things happen to people because of systems like that, and advocating that our elected officials do what they promised during the campaign. I always say this. It irritates me to have people walk around with the little I voted stickers on their shirts and jackets, because that's just the first step in the process. If you're not following those elected officials after they get voted in, if you're not harassing the heck out of them with emails and text messages and phone calls, and like the older people do, grabbing a piece of paper and a pen and an envelope and a stamp and writing a letter to them, if you're not doing that, you're not politically engaged. You just let them do whatever they want to do. They say they're going to do A, B, and C during the campaign, but when you peek behind the curtain, they're actually working on X, Y, and Z instead, unless you direct them and make them do A, B, and C.
A good example of that, whether you like them or not, is NRA. They have galvanized their people. I mean, if you go to a website, I look at their website and they have all the policies, they have all the states, what's going on. They got a letter for members to send their congressmen. Like, they are politically engaged. You touch their gun, they will call you. We need the same thing for these issues as well, right? They're politically engaged. We vote. We like, hey, we're done. Let's Biden and all those guys will take care of it. And then you're like, wait, Biden didn't do anything because we didn't keep them accountable. We don't know what bills are in office. And that's a lot of work. But again, we need organizations like the NRA to help with that, right? That's the missing piece, And
I think, some people are so turned off by the political machinery of this country that they're not going to be politically engaged, but there are enough people that are. So if that's not your lane, hey, I always say, stay in your lane. If that's not the lane that you want to bowl in, go to the next lane over. Only do what you want to do. Only get engaged in the way that you feel passionate about being engaged. I think oftentimes people feel pressure to be engaged in things that they're not comfortable with. And they realize very quickly, this isn't what I want to do. And they drop off. The old bandwagon effect. The bandwagon is really large early on, but then people drop off. It's no different than what you saw with the Black Lives Matter protests around the country. I wrote about this and I said, listen, it's great that all of these white people are woke, but are they going to get the heck out of the bed now that they're woke? Are they going to get up and do something? And I said, I know a lot of them aren't because they're not in the lane they want to be in. So you really have to find a lane, pick a lane, and stay in that lane. Don't try to deviate away and do other things because, you're just going to get frustrated and burned out, and you're just going to give up on that, whatever it is.
I'm going to pop in now because we are about at time. Obviously, this conversation could go on for hours and hours and hours, and will. But I just wanted to say thank you so much to Nate, Reggie, Tarik, the Argosy Foundation, the Zilber Family Foundation, and a huge thank you to everyone who attended and for asking these questions. We did receive more questions via email and in the chat than we were able to answer, so perhaps those will turn into a podcast themselves. Radio Milwaukee is 100% committed to continuing these conversations. We currently are in the midst of hosting some conversations around deep dives into each of the episodes. While those are underway, we will be launching a new set of those in January, so stay tuned if you're interested in being part of smaller group conversations. Like Nate said, the discussion guides for each episode are available online at radiomilwaukee.org/measure. Thank you all so much for coming. Our chat is blowing up now with thank yous. So obviously these are conversations that we need to be having. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your evening. And we will post this video on our page as soon as we can. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.